Good afternoon. Welcome to the sixth lecture of the Paraspar series, Journey of Discovery in Science. As you might, some of you might have been attending our lectures, you might know that in this series we are trying to open up the discussions around science and its processes, the methodologies and the processes of science. Very often, for the lay people, we only know science by the product, but the process, the journey are hardly discussed. So the attempt in this series was to understand what the scientists go through in the journey, or how science is, the final product of science comes about. So in this series today, we have Professor Pankaj Seksaria from IIT Bombay. And before we begin, I would like to give a short introduction of the speaker today. Professor Pankaj Seksaria teaches at the Center for Technology Alternative for Rural Areas and Center for Policy Studies in IIT Bombay, with research interests that lie in the intersection of science, society, technology, and the environment. He graduated as a mechanical engineer from the Pune University in 1993 and master's degree in mass communication from Mass Communication Research Center, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi in 1998. He was awarded a doctorate in 2016 in Science Technology Studies from Maastricht University, Netherlands, for his thesis and cultural innovations, Indian engagement with nanotechnology. He has published widely. Just to read out a few from his publications, his recent book is titled The State of Wildlife in Maharashtra, a compilation of new from the protected area update. He was the editor of this book. In 2019 itself, he has published another book, Instrumental Lives, an intimate biography of an Indian laboratory, published by Taylor and Francis. In 2017, he has published Island in Flux, the Andaman and Nicobar story. And another book he has published, which he is going to talk elaborately about today. That's the book Nanoscale, Society's Deep Impact on Science, Technology and Innovations in India. So we are looking forward to hearing from him. May I request Professor Pankaj Seksaria to give us his lecture.
Good evening. Thank you, Bitasta. Also, thanks a lot to our old friend Samira, who I think made the introduction and probably suggested this topic to Bitasta for this series. I'm honored and privileged to be able to make this presentation, and I think it's a great opportunity for me as well. And I just make one small kind of caveat is that about 10 days ago, I made almost the same presentation on a platform at TIFR here in Bombay. It was a webinar as well. So in case you have attended that, then this is going to be very much, if any one of you attended, so you might want to rethink, but you're of course welcome to join. So let me start quite straight away by a kind of slight twist around in the to bring the topic of what I'm going to present in line with what the series of Paraspar is, which says a journey of discovery in science. And I might actually present and suggest that the presentation I'm going to make today is the journey in discovery of science, because I am going to be presenting work not as much as a scientist, so not of my work of my discovery in the science that I do. So I mean, I have an engineering degree, but my larger interests are increasingly have become in the sociology and the history and the anthropology of science and technology, and I will come to that, and that's going to be the fundamental topic of the talk today. So as the title says, even at the nanoscale, society's deep impact on science, technology, and innovation in India. I will unpack this title because the title is at the heart of what I want to present. And I think you would have noticed, and it's significant that here I'm talking of society's impact on science, technology, innovation, because generally received wisdom is that science and technology influences society in many ways. And if you look at a lot of the literature, which is now changing, is about almost a linear progression of how this happens, which has been challenged a lot, but that kind of continues in a very major way of science to technology to innovation, and then the impacts on society, and then society is impacted and affected. But there is a reverse journey as well that happens, and the PhD work that I did in the field of science and technology studies makes some claims on lines of what I'm going to try and present today. What I'm going to present also is, in a sense, at the heart of what I'm going to present is is the lessons from this book, which is almost the same as the title of the presentation, which is Nanoscale. This is a book, the second of a series of books that have come out of my doctoral work that Bitasta mentioned. This was work I did in Maastricht University. I finished it very recently in 2016, where I studied nanoscience and nanotechnology laboratories using methods and tools that might come as a big surprise to a lot of us, and certainly the audience here at an IISc or a TIFR. How does society impact science, technology, and innovation? How can one prove the impact of this, and what does it really mean for that impact to happen? I'm going to try and unpack this whole thing today. And I'm going to try it in different ways. I'm going to push the envelope a little bit. And to just kind of a quick, before I kind of launch in, is that, like I mentioned, my PhD work was in science and technology, in nanoscience and technology. And I studied a set of 5 laboratories, 2 in Pune, 2 in Hyderabad, and 1 in Chennai, that work in nanoscience and nanotechnology. And I entered the laboratory not as a scientist, but as a social scientist or an ethnographer. And at the end of my thesis, and then also of these 2 books that I'm talking about, these stories emerge and the relationships between science, technology, and society emerge. And in this book, I've tried to capture this through a set of 4 rhyming lines of what are known as quatrains. And I will start off with that and then elaborate into what I want to go. So the story of the first laboratory captured in, sometimes language does a very beautiful job of capturing large theses and large experiences. So this is the story of one laboratory in Pune University, scrapped computers, Juna Bazaar, which is the scrap markets, scrapped computers, Juna Bazaar, a cutting edge STM, well within my radar. So the STM is the scanning tunneling microscope. I'll come to the story in a bit. The story of another laboratory I spent 3 years studying. On one side is Ayurveda, on the other side is science. Very difficult it is to bridge the dividing lines. This is the story of a DST laboratory in Hyderabad, ARCI, and of a particular kind of scientific and technological innovation that they were attempting at the time that I kind of went there, and that's the one that I studied. The old is made new, but the new remains old. There might be nano in the ceramic candle, but few will be sold. This is the story of a very interesting innovation on using nanotechnology to creating a low-cost water filter using the old ceramic candle model that we are all aware of, but it's a failure in the market. So how does one understand that? And this is the final story that is from the LV Prasad Eye Institute and the Shankar Nethralaya in Chennai, LV Prasad Eye Institute in Hyderabad and Shankar Nethralaya. An orphan disease, a tumor in the eye, a one-eyed girl, no, let her die. This is the story of a particular condition of the eye known as retinoblastoma, which is a tumor of children of early age. And there are very interesting dimensions that we come through in the story of how society impacts what happens in the laboratory, say in the workshop, and also certainly in the clinic of a doctor who wants to treat this particular condition. If at any moment I'm not clear or my voice is wavering, I mean, Bitasta or someone can please stop me. And I'm assuming I'm sounding okay and the slides are okay at this point in time.
Yeah, it's fine.
So this is what, if you've seen, and what I want to do is, so there was a certain retrospective construction in the writing of the thesis and in the presentation of this book, and whatever end of the spectrum we look at, and if you look at the first case study, which talks about the entire enterprise of making cutting-edge instruments in the field of nanoscience and technology, which in some senses might be argued is very distant from a direct impact or implication in society, and on the other end is a clinic and a laboratory where translational research is being attempted using nanotechnology, where the primary purpose of the enterprise is to intervene in society. In both those ends of the spectrum, I will try and show how society has an impact. But let me go back really back into history, almost 50 years ago. What is it that I am going to use, or what did I use in my work to present the kind of facts and presentation that I'm going to make today? Now, this is a very interesting, kind of path-breaking book called Laboratory Life. Some of you are perhaps aware of this. Based on work done in the late 1970s, Laboratory Life, The Construction of Scientific Facts by Bruno Latour and Steve Woolgar. This book is based on field lab work done by Bruno Latour in Roger Gilman's laboratory at the Salk Institute, and provides an important link between the sociology of modern sciences and laboratory sciences in the history of science. Now, what is very critical here and what's very important to understand is the methodological innovation that was made first time in this book, and then a lot of other work that happened, and on which I draw upon and I drew upon in my research to tell the stories and to make the conclusions that I make. And what is very interesting, and this little quote I will read through, it appears in the very beginning of this book, which kind of indicates what methods were used, and we'll read that. And this is what Latour and Woolgar write. Since the turn of the century, scores of men and women have penetrated deep forests, lived in hostile climates, and weathered hostility, boredom, and disease in order to gather the remnants of so-called primitive societies. By contrast to the frequency of these anthropological excursions, relatively few attempts have been made to penetrate the intimacy of life among tribes, which are much nearer at hand. This is perhaps surprising in view of the reception and importance attached to their product in modern civilized societies. We refer, of course, to tribes of scientists and to their production of science. So what they do very clearly is that in some senses, the gaze is being turned. To use some kind of analogies, is here the scientists come under the sociological or the ethnographic microscope. And the other very interesting analogy is of the black box. So if technology creates black boxes, and if science also is part of the process, what if we look at the scientific laboratory as a black box? What if we enter that black box and understand what is happening there, and what happens if we unpack that kind of thing? So this is the methodology that they use. And if you look at some of the initial part of the book, it is this person who goes in completely not knowing what is happening there. So you go with this completely clean slate, you try and approach it with a clean slate, and you observe it very dispassionately. You see this set of human beings doing something, and you try and understand that, and then it kind of throws up some interesting. So for instance, what they say in the book is that, in the black box analogy, what is it that goes into a laboratory? And he will say, depending on, there'll be glass tubes, there'll be equipment, there'll be some physical matter. In this case, there was some, pulp brain of some creature. Lots of money will be coming in. People are coming in and out. Paper is going in. Chemicals are going in. And what comes out at the end? What comes out are sheets of paper, because the final output of a scientific laboratory is a scientific paper. But what is this happening between this transaction of the entry of material and the exit of a scientific paper is what they study. So it sets up a very interesting possibility, and now it has been very well accepted even as the methodology of what's broadly called lab studies or lab ethnography, where the lab becomes the field, the scientific laboratory becomes the field for the work of the ethnographer. And while this work was very much within the context of the scientific laboratory and talks about the production of science, there is now a lot of other work on similar lines, drawing on similar methodologies and much larger theories and concepts of making the linkages between what happens inside society and the larger linkages with the world outside. And some of it links up to industry, some of it links up to the military, some of it links up to different dimensions of human society, asking very interesting questions of gender, of resource, of class, etc., etc., etc. And what's also very interesting in this is that Jonas Salk writes in the introduction of this book, and I just thought I will point out some of these things as to how did the scientists who were being studied, how did they respond? And I think it's kind of very interesting. And what Salk says is that scientists have an aversion to what non-scientists say about science. Scientific criticism by non-scientists is not practiced in the same way as literary criticism by those who are not scientists or poets. He says, so he talks about what was done. They spent 2 years, young French philosopher. It was subsequently written up in collaboration with English sociologists. And he goes on to say, he, which is Latour, has tried to observe scientists with the same cold and unblinking eye with which cells or hormones or chemical reactions are studied, a process which may evoke an uneasy feeling on part of the scientists who are unaccustomed to having themselves analyzed from such a vantage point. A scientist in the audience might be able to, I think, quite nicely relate to what is being said here. This kind of objective observation by an outsider of scientists at work, as if they were a colony of ants or of rats in a maze, could be unbearable. But there's another very interesting observation he makes at the end, and which I can kind of reflect upon in my own experience of 4 years in my PhD, going in and out of 5 different laboratories, and I think it's captured here very well. Bruno Latour, a philosopher sociologist, began a sociological study of biology, and along the way came to see sociology biologically. Latour may not fully agree, or he may agree, but this is what. So what is basically is being argued is that there is a osmosis of influence and of ideas that takes place, perhaps. His own style of thought was transformed by our concepts and ways of thinking about organisms, order, information, and mutations, etc. So I'm just setting this up because it's important that the methodology is kind of clear, because it's very central to what kind of claims will be made. So the work that I'm presenting is broadly comes from a academic field called Science and Technology Studies, which has about a 50-year history now in the West. It's relatively new in India. There has been some work in the past, but a lot of the Indian work is more in the policy or in the larger discourse of science and technology. There hasn't been as much work as actually entering, like I say in the second line, the black box of the laboratory, of doing the nuts and bolts, of studying the nuts and bolts of scientific research and technology development. That is still something that has not happened. I don't think we have the kind of human resources and skills. I'm not sure how much of the scientific community might be open. I was very lucky and I had a great opportunity to do this, and I think there's a great possibility and a future for this. So, like I said, you study the science and the scientists, the technology and the technologists. These are also sociological and anthropological studies of science and technology. Also, some broad overview. It's like very clear now. This is about the mainstream of Indian science and technology, because some of the conclusions I made and in a different context do get linked up to what happens in outside science and technology. It is generally in the peripheries of society that one might look at some of those things. But it's important to underline that this is in the heart of the modern science and technology establishment. It is based on a qualitative methodology of interviews, historical analysis, and like I mentioned, lab ethnographies. So what is very fascinating is to, when one spends this time looking at scientists and the laboratories in the way that I did, what really pops up is the kind of diversity of resources, sources, people, ideas, materials, instruments, and knowledge systems. You can see that churn happen inside the laboratory. So if I might just kind of push that argument further, and this objectivity, universality, rationality, and clean, objective kind of thing comes to be questioned, because you see that the processes are not as clean as they're made out to be. And what, and if I might just use the other analogy here in this context, is what is very interesting and now well established in STS is the front stage and the backstage of science. So if I go back to the earlier example, the production of a scientific paper is perhaps the front stage of the scientific effort. And you will see that all scientists will know how much is written in and how much is written out of a scientific paper. Not everything that happens goes in, for reasons that might be obvious to scientists and may or may not be or may or may not be obvious. And what we see backstage, similarly, actually in the context even of theater, the clean and fully choreographed, the perfectly visible, the perfectly done front stage cannot happen if that mess is not there at the back. The mess is what creates that beautiful front stage. And this is a similar kind of thing that we seek to do. And it is when you go into the backstage, you see all different kinds of things that come into play. And I make a kind of normative jump, which I won't go into in this case because there's slightly different context, is although it does go back to a central idea of the Indian landscape, of the diversities of culture, ecology, and of lifestyles, of language that exist in this landscape. And is it possible that this diversity and these differences will not enter the laboratory? And why is it that, or is it being considered? Is it not being considered? Why can we not look at those diversities as an asset rather than create pictures of science that mirrors a certain uniformity and things like that? And I go on to talk about how innovation in the context of the laboratory and in its relationship with the outside gets encultured. So that was what my thesis was. This is a kind of schematic framework of the work that I did. You can see, I will fill this table in slowly. There is the social context, which, if you go back to the title of the talk today, society's impact. So obviously the context of the social reality is very, very critical. So what I did in my thesis and in the book I'm talking about is I, in a retrospective manner, hung each of the case studies to a certain social reality, which we have many social realities in this country, but we would broadly agree that these are very much a part of Indian reality. This is a society which is very deeply resource constrained. We know millions of our people don't have resources. And even in the scientific establishment, there is huge disparity between who has resources and who does not have resources. This is a very common complaint you will hear of certain institutional setups being much more resourced, for example, state universities and that kind of thing. So this idea of resource constraint, which is a spectrum of resource constraints, is obviously a reality, and how do people deal with that? We are also very interestingly a country of multiple knowledge systems. We might not all agree with those, but we also know that in this diversity and in this size, whether it's medicine, whether it is language, whether it is the way we understand agriculture, we have traditional practices and different knowledge systems that are very different from the modern science that, say, happens in the laboratory. Now, will this or will this not impact or affect the modern scientific enterprise? And what happens when an effort is made, in this particular case, to bring in an Ayurveda practitioner into a modern nanobioscience lab, for instance? So the point here is that we are still a country and a society that has these multiple knowledge systems. How does it impact, and how can it be made to more productively impact, might be an interesting question to ask. There's a social exigency where one of the case studies about the water filter I mentioned, in such a large country, 70 years after independence, we are still not able to provide this basic human need of clean drinking water. How does the science and technology establishment respond to that? So again, very clearly, we can't deny that social reality or that physical reality, and what happens in that case. And finally, there is patriarchy, requires no explanation of any kind, a deeply unequal society where women are marginalized at multiple levels. And this is the case study I mentioned of in LV Prasad and Shankar Netralaya, where we will see the story of what happens to a girl child, for instance, who comes into the clinic with a certain medical condition. So I have these four social realities, and I will try and make a case of how each of these, in their own different way, impacts the scientific and the technological enterprise at multiple nodes in different kinds of ways. So the first story, I will go into some detail, is the story of the making of what is perhaps the first, or certainly one of the earliest, scanning tunneling microscopes in India. It's a story that starts in the late 80s, early 90s. I will come to that in greater detail. And there is a conceptual framework that I tried to put in, which which I discuss in different spaces. We'll see if we have the time to do that here. The second one is the story of one research wing in the Center for Nanobioscience at Agarkar Research Institute in Pune, where headed by Professor Paknikar, who was eventually also director of ARI and now has retired. But here they were trying to see what is the relationship between nanobioscience, nanotechnology, and Ayurveda. Particularly the Rasashastra kind of tradition and the bhasmas, because we all know some of the claims, the operative claims are that the bhasmas, the operating principles are at the nanoscale. So they have tried a very interesting collaboration of what happens when you actually bring in an Ayurveda, a trained Ayurveda practitioner into the laboratory and try different things. I won't go into details of this particular laboratory and this story, but you get the point I think I'm trying to make. The third is the case of water filters in ARC and Hyderabad, where, like I mentioned, a very simple innovation, one might argue, of using the standard white ceramic candle and creating a new process by which it was impregnated by nanosilver, because of the obvious benefits that silver gives in water purification, to create a low-cost water filter that people were very used to using. And it seems, and I like I write, it's like an entire constellation of everything comes together. Nanoscience, easy technology, low cost, it follows gravity, so no problem. It is something that people know, scientists are involved, etc., etc. So it seems high technology, low cost, an important need is fulfilled, but the technology and the product fails in the market completely. How do we understand that? Why does that happen? So there are certain ways in which I draw those conclusions. And we see again how the very basic fact that water is not available, how does it influence the entire research process? And then, like I mentioned, in these two eye hospitals that have a very interesting configuration where the clinician is also expected to do bench research. So I think following a system that we see in large parts of the West, where and Professor Balasubramanian, who founding director and head of research, he said to me very explicitly that we put the clinic and the laboratory in the same building because we want the scientists to be constantly aware of the reality of the patient, and we want the clinician to know what can happen in the laboratory. And as a matter of fact, in these two institutions, the clinician is supposed to do bench research himself or herself, and his work and his evaluation is kind of also influenced by the scientific output that they do. And here we will see what happens in the case of a girl child who comes to the clinic. I'm going to go into details of two stories at two ends of the spectrum. Like I mentioned, the story of the scanning tunneling microscope, which in some senses has no real impact on the general lives of people, because it is really far away from what the concerns of the common person would be. And on the other end of the spectrum, I will come to the story of what happens in these two eye hospitals, where the entire purpose of the research and the purpose of the existence of these institutions is first up is to intervene and to make differences. So let's go on to the next story, and I'll come to the L.V. Prasad one in a bit of a detail. Now, this is the other book that Bitasta mentioned. This also came out very recently. The India edition came out only about less than a year ago. Instrumental Lives is a monograph on the story of this one particular laboratory. And actually, we have Professor Dharmadhikari, who headed the laboratory. He joined us today as well. And like the subtitle says, the book is an intimate biography. So over 4 years, I kind of entered the lab. I happened to enter the laboratory at a very interesting moment. The full stories are there in the books of even the life of the particular laboratory. But I will go into some of these aspects of what I saw there. So this is, I think it will become clear, those 4 lines that I mentioned in the beginning. So again, this audience certainly does not need to know and would know the background, but this is a model of among the earliest STMs that the picture that Professor Dharmadhikari gave me. So the Nobel Prize for one half of the Nobel Prize for Physics of 1986 was awarded to the makers of the STM, which was the team at the IBM in Zurich. And as we all know, it is credited with having spawned this kind of absolutely exploding field now of nanoscience and nanotechnology, because it allowed us to visualize in a non-optical manner at the nanoscale. So in 86, and I'm going to tell the story really short and just bring out the key points of this societal context, is that in the late 80s, like I said in the very beginning, there was this team in Pune University and perhaps in other laboratories and institutions in the country as well. I do know of a couple where I've got part of the story. I don't have the full story, but I think they would make for very interesting accounts. So the first time I entered the laboratory, Dharmadhikari's laboratory, this was a kind of abiding image that I still remember of seeing, and I also have a picture. Here you see the tripod on which you can see these cables from which the plate, heavyweight plate, and on this is the instrument of the scanning tunneling microscope, which was made in this particular laboratory. And here the refrigerator was used not for a cooling purpose or anything of that kind, but as a vibration, as a sound isolation device. And what emerged in me looking at this work, and that was one of the key things that emerged, is that how does one innovate and make do in a situation where you don't have the resources, but you have an idea that you want to implement? And I'm quite sure that a large part of the Indian scientific community does associate with that reality. If not today, certainly in early part of the career. If not in this institution, certainly in another institution that you perhaps were part of. And what happens very interestingly is that this kind of thing somehow gets written out of the narratives of how the science is then presented. And there's a much larger literature also on the relevance of these kinds of things in scientific work, but we won't go there. And why I'm bringing this here is eventually based on this case study and extended work, I proposed a kind of a characterization of innovation, of which this idea of reconfiguring materiality, which I call, is of taking an object which was made for something and had a certain purpose, but reusing it or repurposing it for something completely different, because you primarily don't have the resources to do that kind of thing. So a vibration isolation table that might have costed, whatever it might have costed, and you would know better than I do, if it is not available or the resources are not available, how do you still go about and do the things that you want to do? It may not be perhaps an absolutely optimum kind of solution, maybe suboptimal, but does it not solve the problem that you want to solve? So what I saw in this particular laboratory, there were cases after cases after cases and examples after examples where one sees these kinds of interesting use of material, of reconfiguring and repurposing that material. And again, in the books, I kind of write in much greater detail. I just want to give you some of those examples of that so that we can, you can perhaps make the connection. And the important point here is this is that social context of resource constrained society, of a poor society, if I might say so, where everything that you want is perhaps not available. Another similar kind of instrument, and again a vibration isolation system, inflated tube of a car tire, heavy plates, multiple layers of plates separated by Vuitton rubber tubing, basically creating multiple layers of isolation and from the floor where vibrations will then not be transmitted. This story, the entire story of this laboratory, was also published in the Current Science in 2013. And I mean, we made it fortunately the cover of the issue because it was a nice picture. This is a macro picture of the inside of one of the instruments, or perhaps the last set of instruments that were made in this laboratory by the last PhD student in that laboratory. And you can see from the scale, it's really small. The tuning fork is what was bought from a second-hand watch dealer, from a quartz watch just outside of Pune University. And here this was in a combined STM AFM setup. And you can see the, so used primarily as a cantilever. And so this idea of reusing materials in different kinds of ways to then develop something that is really cutting edge. And the question is that how do you know it is cutting edge? Because a lot of these ideas are then dismissed as this is not a good quality, this is jugaad, for instance, or this is suboptimal, this is a corruption of the idea, this is bad quality, etc., etc., etc. But you see that I'm putting forward that almost as a straw man to destroy, to say that even this kind of work, and I'm just giving you some very small examples, there is a lot more in this lab and surely in other stories. Developing instruments in this way, in this kind of context, they delivered research in the frontier areas of modern science. The lab published in the world leading peer-reviewed scientific journals. PhD students came out with great skills and qualities and were accepted as postdocs in the leading labs around the world. And training in instrument building becomes an important part of university education. And this is very, very important because if you look at the narrative of contemporary current science administration in India and globally, and I have a couple of examples in the work that I looked up, and as a matter of fact, from the editorials in the Current Science by Professor Balram, and there's another simultaneously in 2012, 2013 when I was writing up from Nature magazine, where very senior scientists and scientific administrators are making this point almost unanimously, saying that the problem today in scientific research, and certainly certain kinds of scientific research, is too much resources, financial resources, and not enough human resource to be able to do justice to that equipment that is bought. And again, I think this community here will know of how many instances of equipment that is bought because money is available, but we don't have the human resources or human skills to be able to do justice to that equipment. What happens if it breaks down? What happens about servicing, etc., etc., etc. And here is an enterprise that actually creates that human resource. It may be small, and there are challenges in that because it takes time to kind of create a student and a scientist with the capacity to deal with instrumentation at that level. And an important question needs to be asked, and people do ask, is of the reward system in science and technology, because students and senior scientists will say that somebody doing this kind of instrument making in the eventual evaluation does suffer, because somebody who's working with a just bought equipment can publish 4 or 5 or 6 papers by the time this instrument making student or scientist is actually able to make his instrument. So Professor Murli Shastri, who was at NCL and now he's at the Monash University in Australia, was one of my respondents. He was a collaborator of Dharmadhikari in his work when he was at NCL. And Shastri said something interesting. He said the downtime in instrument building is not accounted for in the whole process. So it's important to understand that in resource constrained situations, you have these very interesting outputs and what the challenges are. And the other very interesting point I would like to just highlight is that in all the discussions I had at the time I was doing my studies, there was a very interesting response I got when I put the story across to many people, and whether it was in science or outside. And they said, oh, it was very interesting if these instruments were made, but then why weren't they commercialized? And it was very, first I didn't understand why the questions were being asked, and then you realize that that is the narrative in which we are living today. So a scientific effort that is not claiming to make anything commercial or in the market domain is asked a question that is not even seeking to answer. And while the question of finance and sustainability and output is an important one, I think we can't be evaluating every scientific enterprise or everything that we do with those frameworks, because they are meant for something else. So we have students here who are extremely capable and confident of dealing with equipment in the context that we are. But we are only asking the question of why was it not commercialized, as if there was nothing else that is supposed to be done. And if you look at the literature in a post-90s context, and including with what's been done in the CSIRs and in the institutions in India today, the idea of the entrepreneurial university, which is an important one, and the new liberal kind of economics has really taken center stage. It is a trajectory we can't deny. I mean, it's all linked in the larger part of the context we are. But I think we have to keep in mind that the questions that we ask have to be in the context of what is actually offered. And based on this, I was mentioning to earlier, I really have to cut the story short, but based on this whole enterprise that I saw and also extended literature survey and looking at other work, I am proposing a configuration or a proposition of innovation, which is very socially and culturally very embedded. And these are the 8 points which are open for discussion, which I think require more empirical engagement across fields, not just in science, but in the workshop and otherwise. And I'm doing some work on those lines. But these are the 8 characteristics, and I'll come to the title of what I call this later. Like I said, there's reconfiguring materiality. There are bridging ways of knowing and knowledge systems. There is problem solving, which is part of all innovation. It is driven by resource constraint. I think there's a very interesting theme of the commons that exist. So, for example, the availability of scrap materials for cheap or for free or for waste for free. What is waste for you may not be waste for somebody else. That we have the spaces where people can sell and buy materials which may not be available in many other countries now. You know, this common space, this more and less common, there's interesting literature there. There is a broad liminality. There's a certain problematic in this also in some ways, because all innovation is going to push the boundaries of existing frameworks. Also, if you look at this kind of broader idea of innovation, you see that it does not start off trying to be commercial. It does not start off trying to make innovation to make money, because the idea is to just survive, is to get by, which is what a lot of people in this country are trying to do. So they're using the means available, the materials available, the knowledge systems available to scrape by, to live, just to survive. They're not trying to make money. That's far away in their whole thing. And what I'm saying is that certain scientific enterprises and efforts are part of that same continuum. If it may not be survival of your own existence, it might be survival of your scientific career, for instance. And the fact that you need to innovate in situations where resources are not available. And of course, there is the culture of recycling, which goes back into reconfiguring materiality and of problem solving and resource constraint, and is such an important dimension in today's environmental crisis. And I call this technological jugaad. I go into great detail about what jugaad is, because and we can have a 2-hour discussion and a big fight on what jugaad is, whether it's right or wrong. But I have just one main contention to make is that nobody really or very minimal kind of very critical and rigorous engagement has been done with the idea of Jugaad in literature. There are many bodies of Jugaad literature. Okay, there is the etymology. Where does it come from? How is it used? Whose concept is it? Why do we always end up, looking at the extreme? Either Jugaad is very good, that's increasingly being seen in management literature, or it is extremely problematic. It is corruption. It is not innovation. It is not systematic, etc., etc., etc. But my plea and my effort has been that we have to rigorously engage with this. And one is not saying all Jugaad is good, or one cannot say all Jugaad is bad, because we have a tendency to, if something goes wrong, we dismiss it by saying it is Jugaad. So it is. It needs to be re-examined because it's a very deeply embedded part of the culture of this landscape. Certainly north of the Vindhyan mountain ranges. In the 4 or 5 southern states, I don't know whether there is an equivalent for Jugaad in Kannada, Malayalam, or Tamil. Certainly the languages in the northern part, Gujarati, Hindi, you go down to the east, into the east, you have it over there, and the meanings are roughly the same. So can it be mobilized? Can it be understood in interesting ways? I think is the challenge for us. I'm going to the next case study, and I will finish it in 10 minutes, much shorter. This is an LV Prasad Eye Institute. Now the story here is very interesting, and I must say it's also a little moving. Now, retinoblastoma is a tumor of the eye of little children. It really comes to children at the infant stage. It's a very small numbers. They say about 1,600 new cases are reported every year. So it's a very small number considering 500,000 children die of diarrhea every year in this country. But for people, of course, who get it, there is that's almost the end of the whole thing. Which is why there is the idea of the orphan disease and the orphan even disciplines, for example, in science and in sociology or whatever, where because it is not so important or not perceived to be so important, it does not get the attention that it deserves. So you have this orphan disease with a tumor in the eye. And what happened in these 2 cases in LV Prasad Eye Institute and in Shankar Nethralaya, at 2 different moments when I was talking to these clinician scientists there, completely independent of each other, both of them said to me almost the same thing. They said that, so how it works in retinoblastoma, if I might just go in there, is that in a normal course, if the tumor is detected in time and if treatment is given, the standard chemotherapy works, of course, the systemic chemotherapy, and the child can be saved and the eye can be saved. In an extreme situation when the tumor escapes the eye, it's a little child, it's very unlikely that you can save the child. But there is an intermediate stage where the doctors tell me that the tumor might have grown, so the eye will be lost, vision will be lost. But what you have to do is you can remove the eyeball. So you remove the tumor, you remove the eye, you save the life of the child, but the child loses vision and loses the eye. And what the doctors are trying to do, at least one of the efforts, and that's what took me there because my thesis was in nanotechnology, they were trying to use and develop a nanotechnology based protocol for the delivery of the anti-cancer drug directly to the eye. So we all know the capacities and the possibilities of what nanomaterials can do. But what both these doctors told me is that when parents come to them with a child, and more often in the case of a girl child than in the case of a boy child, when the doctors and the clinicians tell the parents that the tumor has become too much, we will save your child, but we will remove the eye of the child. The eye of the child has to be removed if the child has to be saved. And both these doctors tell me that in many cases, Pankaj, what happens is, and what we see is that if it is a girl child, the parents don't come back to the clinic. They rather let the child die. And it's very obvious. And that's where the whole idea of the status of the girl child comes in, is that who will marry a one-eyed girl? And Javed Ali, who's the oncologist and the clinician and the scientist in LV Prasad, and he very explicitly says in his interviews that parents say, who will marry a one-eyed girl or a girl with a deformity, a one-eyed or a one-handed or a one-leg girl. So in that reality, how deeply that kind of influences. And what I found very interesting conceptually was what they seem to be saying and doing is that in creating a nanotechnology protocol for the treatment of the eye, where Javed Ali told me that it's far away from application, but even if it does, we might still not be able to save vision, but we'll be able to save the eye in its position. So you will still have a child or a person who looks with only one eye, but appears to have two eyes. So, if one extends the argument, it is almost like the doctor is saying, and the scientist is saying, I want a medical and a technical intervention, not to deal with the medical condition of the child and the particular individual, but to deal with the social condition in which that particular individual is located. And this is the social condition in which a one-eyed child and one-eyed girl is a lesser or a less equal human being in this particular society. So it's very interesting, because if you start looking at the multiple layers of how this comes in, then you see how deeply this reality intervenes. And in the case of a medical doctor, I think it's a very obvious one. But what happens in this particular case in the LV Prasad is that when a clinician enters LV Prasad Eye Institute, for instance, they have to become, like I said, a scientist. So you are adding multiple layers to the understanding and the complexity of this individual as well. And when this kind of child enters the clinic, what is the social reality that it brings in? And I'll just give you one more example before I move on, is that in the Shankar Nethralaya case, again, I was talking to, in an interview with the doctor there, he said, he was giving me the example of one case where a child had come to him, girl child again, and he said, I mean, we can do something, but you come back after 2 months, and that child never came back. And the parents came back after 6 months, and the tumor had grown tremendously, and the doctor was livid. He said, I got so upset, I started shouting at him. I said, who do you think you are? Why do you give birth to children if you don't care? I had told you to come back in 2 months. And he said, and he was telling me the story, and he said, this father heard me very patiently. The father had become emotional, and after a while he said, I completely agree with you, doctor, I should have come. But I have a mother who's dying of a heart condition, and I have this child who's dying of this tumor of the eye. I am not in a position to save both. I have to make a choice. Now, how does one? So one might almost argue that in that social reality, what is the decision that father is going to make, or what he needs to make? It becomes such a complex kind of situation. But here, what happens is that it is what I'm trying to say. The point I'm trying to make is that the multiple realities that you bring in. For the clinician, you bring in the reality of the lab, and you say that you have to develop protocols and do research. And in that same scientist clinician kind of hybrid, you also have the social reality come in. And when the social reality enters these spaces, it transforms the nature of the effort that is done. So I will not go into any of the great details here, but just there's a lot of work in user studies, which also comes from design, but also comes from science and technology, where in the innovation discourse, for example, the user now has become very important, and there are many categories, some very interesting empirical research and conceptualizations, a lot of them from the West, increasingly from India. But I just want to kind of come back and down to this one, which I found very, very useful and interesting. This is the idea of the non-user. So we generally, the belief that why do people not use technology or not use a particular solution? We have a tendency to dismiss if we are using a technology and we think it is extremely sophisticated. Like just now, just before we began, between Vitasta and me, we needed 15 minutes to figure out how to make a presentation on Microsoft Teams. Okay. So the assumption that because I can do it well, everybody else can do it well, I think is deeply embedded in the way technologists and scientists think, I believe. But the idea of why technology doesn't get used, and it's a very interesting typology, that there are multiple reasons why technologies are not used. There may be the expelled. There may be the girl child who wants to use that, or there might be a certain section of society that wants to use the technology. But because of their class, caste, gender, financial status, they might actually be expelled. And on the other hand, the same technology, I might have the resources, I might have the capacity, but I might resist. I might make a choice not to use that technology. And this could be certainly very influenced by the social context I come from. And I think in innovation studies, it's a very interesting category to look at, because this non-user is your prime target. It is in the conversion of the non-user to the user of what you want to offer, whether it's a solution or a technology, that the success of your effort is based. Because It is the non-user whom you need to convert. So this becomes a very interesting frame, so to say. And if I take this forward, it is not that each one of us is just one category. And I'm conceptualizing this and I'm just taking this forward to make the point I want to make here. This girl child who came into the clinic is not one identity. Like each one of us had multiple identities. The same girl child is actually aggregate of multiple non-users. She is the helpless infant. She is the conceptually the married, to be married woman of tomorrow. It is also the immediate family that is the non-user, because in the use or in the rejection or in the resisting or in being expelled, there are implications on the family. There are financial implications, there are social implications, and there are emotional implications. And of course, there is the eventual non-user, so to say. So what you have is, and I'm going back to the key point I want to make is that somebody who is using that science or that technology is constructed in a particular way. Each one is unique, but each one is influenced by that larger context. That context of the society, of the language, of the culture, etc., etc. And when this person enters the laboratory, not physically, but those concerns come in a different way in the instrument making laboratory, in a completely different way in this particular situation. You see that this aggregate of multiple non-users or multiple identities configures the identity of the person who's also producing the solution, is producing the technology, is doing the science. So a clinician who entered a LV Prasad Eye Institute has to become a scientist, has to take on a different role, almost has to become a social activist when the social reality enters that space. And the point I want to make is that that is completely inescapable. It might be different degrees depending on where the research or the development is located, but there is no way it can be escaped. In the case of that first laboratory, not availability of resources. In the case of in Agarkar Research Institute, the fact that there are, Ayurveda doctor comes in, and I remember this first interview with Paknikar, head of the institution, and I was asking him about this thing, and he got excited, and then he said, leave it, Pankaj, don't even ask, because we have this Ayurveda doctor and practitioner in our lab, but what he says I don't understand at all, and what I say he doesn't understand at all, and they're still trying to work together. So how does that influence the scientific process? So what happens is that the aggregate of non-users creates an aggregate of producers. And what is very critical there, and certainly in this case, is how do we define and understand the nature of the problem? So is it a social problem? Is it a technical medical problem? Or obviously we will agree that it is not something that is independent of the other. It is a intersectional problem. And the intersection is there, whatever the problem might be, only its nature will change. The case of the girl child is a very obvious one here. But any other issue you look at, I want to propose, and that's my submission, that this entanglement, this embedding of the scientific process in the social context cannot be escaped. That will come about. And if the understanding of the problem, I mean, that is, I think, very, very important, almost from a philosophical point of view, is that how we choose to understand the problem certainly defines the contours of the solution. And that is something that I would like to leave you with, because that is what the thing is. And I'm just kind of, a few months ago, I'd also presented the similar talk, a different one at the NCBS archives, but I will leave that. And I will end here because it's almost an hour. Thank you very much for listening in and for this opportunity. And I'd be very glad to get comments, feedback, and of course, anything that you disagree with. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the insightful lecture. Shall we take some questions now? May I request those who want to ask any question, any comment, to type in their comments or the questions in the chat box, and I'll read them out. Or do you, yeah, I saw somebody unmuting themselves. Mr. Amit Kumar, do you want to ask a question? Your voice is breaking. If you can type it in the chat box, it would be nice.
If you can also introduce yourselves either in the chat, so one also knows who. Should I stop sharing the screen?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can.
And what happens? What do you see now? You don't see anything?
I see, yeah, I don't see your presentation. Mr. Mohammed Sajid, you can ask your question. You can unmute yourself and ask. Yeah.
Okay, ma'am. Sir, my name is Muhammad Sajir and I am an MTech student in Nanoscience and Engineering at IAC. So I was actually excited about this talk. I mean, I never thought of a sociological perspective of science and labs, and I was kind of interested in sociology also. So I never thought there is a interlinking is possible. And I just want to thank you for this talk. And it was really exciting. I will contact you.
Okay. So will I get pass marks? Have I convinced you?
Yeah. Good full mark.
Full marks. Okay, thank God. Okay. So it will be like AA in IIT grading system.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
There are two comments in the chat box. One is by Mr. Kaushik Hatti. He says, fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. And one is by Mr. Satyamurthy. Interesting view of science and society, Pankaj. Nano is incidental. Otherwise, the issues are quite common.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, the most recent review of the book in the Open magazine by Srinath Perur, I think Kannada audience will know him very well. He says exactly the same thing. He ends the review by saying it's interesting, but the technology in a sense becomes incidental.
Chinar, you can ask your question. You can unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm an early stage PhD scholar who's also trying to work in the field of STS at University of Hyderabad. So I have two questions, and I'm sure that if I read the book, then I'll get much more clarity on it. But if you can just briefly talk about this a little bit, that one question is why, how did you land on the decision of picking case studies for your entire research, as in. And that is tied to my second question, which is to ask, how did you pick these particular laboratories as your field of focus? Because the way that your table, for example, the way that the table was there, and I mean, I assume that you, the sort of the context for each of those sites, I'm assuming that you developed those later on, or was it something that you knew going in? So that, if you can just briefly talk about it.
Sure. I think very good question, and I can probably understand where it's coming from, because you must be getting palpitations about accessing field site for study. So how this PhD project happened was completely actually serendipity, which is a very interesting dimension even in scientific work, because a lot of science happens by serendipity. I was in the right place at the right time, where my professor, eventually whom I did my PhD with, Professor Biker from Maastricht University, who's very well known among other things for the social construction of technology. It's very interesting, both heuristics and conceptually. He was looking for he had a project in which he was looking for an India PhD student, and I just happened to be really at the right time at the right place. And in a sense, I was also, it was very clear what I had to do, because even the broad contours of the project had been decided, which was going to be innovation in nanoscience and nanotechnology, and broadly also the methodologies were kind of given, so to say. I was open to the idea because I was also at a moment where I was willing to experiment and take these chances, and it was a good kind of offer in terms of a PhD project. Where the case studies were concerned, no, it's completely a matter of trying out and seeing where you can get access. So, and you're right, and I think I also mentioned it. I constructed the thesis in a kind of retrospective, rational kind of this thing, that I went ahead and did the work. And then I did a reconfiguring retrospectively to say, okay, this case study can be tied around this particular theme. Because when I went to all of these labs, I didn't even know who would say yes or who would say no. And I had no idea of what I will discover. You see, I mean, that is so central in STS, where the idea of the emergent, the idea of the fact that you don't know what will come out is very central. So you cannot really go asking or looking for something. I mean, something, you have a broad idea, but you never know what will emerge. So that's a retrospective kind of thing to make sense in the writing up of the story, which STS allows you to kind of do. But it's really dependent on taking a chance, on exploring, on being lucky with people giving you access. Why people give you an access is tricky. it could be luck, it could be the individual's personality, it could be a moment in the life of the laboratory. So I think it's a matter of really, I don't know of any foolproof method to kind of go and get it done. And then we have to open up to the idea and see what eventually emerges, because I think I'm confident that this kind of work will throw up something very interesting. I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Anushree, can you unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yeah. Hi, thank you for the presentation. I joined midway, so my question might be a little out of context, but I remember briefly you mentioned something about the Jugaad literature, and I'm also an early stage PhD student. I'm doing my PhD in IIT Hyderabad. So my work is also around entrepreneurship and innovation broadly. I'm still figuring out the exact field side, but that bit was really interesting to me because I've also thought about Jugaad, but I never know where to start. So if like on the basis of your work, if you could just like briefly talk about your opinion on this and how the concept of Jugaad emerged in the process of your research, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
That will be an underhand thing, but I think you should read what I've written in either the book or the paper and all that, because I have written considerable amount of on Jugaad now. And you know, I'll answer your question, but also the latest thing that I've kind of worked on, which takes this case study again, is the whole discourse on frugal innovation, because frugal innovation is very often used interchangeably with Jugaad. So you look at a lot of literature in management, so they say frugal innovation, then they will say Jugaad, and some of them, of course, dismiss it, but that problem is there. So, you know, Anushree, there's a very wide range of stuff that already exists in Jugaad. And the problem, I think, in the management literature is that they come at it, and I'm talking, for example, of the book Jugaad Innovation, which I've also critiqued in many other places, other very senior management people and stuff like that. But and it goes both ways. There is extreme kind of celebration and extreme dismissal. It is coming as if it's a blank slate. And if you start to engage with the different kinds of ways that have been looked at and the different kinds of ways that have been mobilized, you see that it is far more complex and far more, I think, creating possibilities of a more embedded kind of understanding. And the problem, I think, also is that certainly, I don't know what kind of studies you're going to do, but there's a need and a demand for prescription, for giving solutions. Whereas a lot of the STAs, a lot of the social science work is more descriptive. It seeks to understand. And I cannot prescribe Jugaad as a way forward to do things, for instance. I would say this is what's happening. This is what I'm seeing around in the world that I am part of. And how I came about to it is, and again, I write about it, is that, you know, the moment you talk about innovation, my family is from North India. I grew up in Pune. I'm a Hindi speaking person. So Jugaad is very much a language that, a part of the language that you come across. Okay, as a child growing up, I do remember we use it, and it's there all over the place. So I was very clear that I don't want to kind of engage with Jugaad as a matter of fact, because of all the problems that are associated with it. But particularly when I went into this lab in Pune University and I saw this kind of work that was happening, there was no other, you can say innovation, you can say tinkering, you can say creative improvisation, which are terms in innovation studies, but nothing captures the essence, if I might say, the fragrance of the soil, as it were, than what emerges from the language of that particular place. And if you have access to that language, if you have access to the meanings of that language, then nothing captures it more beautifully. I mean, say Jugaad on the one hand and say creative improvisation on the other. It means completely different things. It evokes a different memory, it evokes a different idea, it evokes a different, the performativity is very, very different. So I resisted very deeply to use that word, but understanding what Jugaad meant and what I understood of Jugaad, I just felt that there could be no other way to kind of engage with that. So that's how I was pushed into engaging with it. And then I tried to unpack it a little bit. And what's very interesting is that if you look at other languages, the concept that, say, a Jugaad, in whatever way we understand it, it is not that only this language has a concept of this kind. If you go into the French, I mean, there are many other different ideas, but the idea of bricolage, if some of you are aware of, or the bricolier, which Claude Lévi-Strauss writes in A Savage Mind, in there is a word that goes by that, conveys a similar kind of meaning. So this idea of using materials, and if as a matter of fact, if you look at the definition of the bricolier, and if I just picked out the definition of the bricolier by Lévi-Strauss in the French, in the context that he talks about, and I did not tell you what it was, you would actually say this is Pankaj, you're defining the jugadu. He talks of the bricolier using resources around him and using devious means to find a solution for the problem that they have in front of them. So it is not surprising, is it? It cannot be surprising that all cultures at some point of time have had those situations of resource constraints, of finding solutions to problems that nobody has given a solution for. So what can you mobilize? You can only mobilize what's around you, what you have. And as a matter of fact, there is very interesting work even in the more economic innovation studies, work by Eric von Hippel, if the name rings a bell for you particularly, Anushri. He writes about how even in scientific instrument making, it is the first mover of the innovation and the making is the scientist, because it is a scientist who knows what he or she wants. Nobody else can even give it to him. And if you look at accounts of cutting edge instrument making across the globe, even in a contemporary context, whether it's America or the US, or Europe or other parts, these kinds of methods are very, very common. So one of my colleagues, in a sense, and I just finished with that, is a guy called Cyrus Modi. He's a professor of technology, history of technology in Maastricht. His work, one of his works was also on the history of scanning tunneling microscope making in Europe and America. And he talks of scientists who he spoke to who did exactly the same thing. They use the hair of their eyebrow for a lightweight cantilever, or they use foils, thin foils, or they use crushed diamond, or somebody picked up a old disused cannon on campus and converted it into a vacuum chamber. So it is not that this is uncommon. It's only that it is not told in that kind of context. So I mean, I've said many things, but what I think Jugaad needs is a far more detailed engagement with the concept. What happens in the Indian context, if something has gone wrong, we dismiss it, he did Jugaad. No, he just did fraud, for example. Why do you call it Jugaad? Without actually explaining to us what you mean by Jugaad. I have not seen a characterization of Jugaad anywhere, which is what I've attempted. And I just finish by saying that the Jugaad idea is so powerful that it kind of, it takes all discussions in that direction, which is why I'm very reluctant to even bring it up. But yeah, I hope that answers to some extent.
Yeah, no, I understand. Thank you so much for that answer.
Are there any more questions?
Tires takes Jugaad to innovation. I don't know, Satyamurthy. I mean, I would, what do you mean by Jugaad? I think is that would be my question, because I mean that it's a methodological thing. I would like to argue. Why would we call it innovation and why would we not call it Jugaad, or vice versa? My sense is that we are using, all of us are just using it in a way that is without any very deep engagement with what we mean when we say it.
Well, I would say the term innovation is to be used when you can scale up, when you can commercialize. Now, frugal innovation comes somewhere in between. In frugal innovation, profit is not the motive. That is why I would classify the bullock cart, which was with the tires introduced by AK and Reddy. People in IISc know this very well. You also probably would know this very well. That could not be dismissed as a Jugaad, and that was definitely not given the status of innovation, but it was appreciated. And today, of course, you see a lot of bullock carts with tires. So it comes under the frugal innovation. But I still am not able to define Jugaad. I can give a story by Balram, since you referred to Balram. Both of us were staying in the guest house in Banaras Hindu University. Morning breakfast table, Balram said with his characteristic style, last night I complained about mosquitoes. He said, last night when I wanted a mosquito repellent or that all out, the fellow brought that mat, and there was a reading lamp. On top of it, he put the mosquito repellent mat and went away. I said, wow, what a simple solution to the problem. But later on, when I wanted to sleep, I means Balram wanted to go to sleep, he had to turn the light off. And then he realized that mosquito mat is of no use anymore. So I think the Jugaad is used temporarily for that particular moment, minimum cost, etc., etc. I'm sorry that, of course, if I could define Jugaad, you would have defined Jugaad yourself. But anyway, leaves that for us to think. So anyway, so I wanted to just share my thoughts. I had sent this to you by email.
Yes.
And here again, I reiterated the connection between Jugaad innovation and frugal innovation. As I told you in my mail, Mashelkar and others call disruptive innovation. That is the one, like iPhone is supposed to be a disruptive innovation. And I leave it at that. I will have an opportunity to talk to each other, I'm sure.
Sure, sure. I mean, there are lots of things.
I enjoyed listening to you. Before I close, I just want to say
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I enjoyed reading your book from cover to cover.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's a lot to be discussed because I think we have gone away with, what is frugal innovation? Because even the Tata Nano was considered frugal innovation. Is it really that the car that the Tata's made? Is that really frugal innovation? What does disruptive innovation mean? What does it actually disrupt? And why are we so excited about disruptive innovation? What happens to those places and people whose innovation is disrupted? So I just want to say, I just want to open up these things because we have closed these categories a little too much, in my opinion. And we are just going on with, in the literature and otherwise, with some standard ideas that I think require a lot of unpacking.
Here there is a lot of social and commercial competing interests come into play. This Tata Nano, even from within there was opposition to Tata Nano. And similarly, the ARCI filter, nano filter, Tata's introduced in the market Swatch. I was quite impressed with the Swatch and I was sold on Swatch. But Swatch did not compete with the AquaGuard, which is promoted with the Hema Malini's advertisement. So we are getting into a very complex domain where there is, it's not only just the commercial feasibility, marketing success, competing interests. At some stage, there can be cutthroat competition as well. This is a very complex issue on which I have no expertise at all. I only look at it as a common man.
Sure.
There is a picture sent by to show Jugaad. Okay. There's a comment by Supreet: to make innovative products, one needs to know or master a field and apply and succeed. Is that hindering innovations in India as it takes time, or can it be fast forwarded?
It's a very large question. I don't know. I mean, we have to also see whether, it can be answered and questioned in many kinds of ways. So I will not try and even answer that because, like just mentioned earlier by Satyamurthy, of course, it's complex. There are many other things that come into play. And all I'd like to say is that the idea is also to look at inside the scientific establishment and the scientific process, what happens inside. So when scientists are doing these kinds of things, how do you look at it? Why do you do the kinds of things that you do? Where do you see the influences of science and technology? The influence of society on your scientific research or what you're trying to do. And there are questions of space, of resources, of gender, of caste, and many things that can come in. generally we tend to brush that aside and say that they don't matter. And my real contention would be that no, they do matter, and we have to look at that, because all these things are deeply influencing. We saw two cases, and I mean, it would really depend on how well I'm able to convince you of that. But in other ways, how does it happen, or where does it happen? What happens outside, of course, is important, and innovation and all that is important. But I'm arguing that all this kind of thing happens inside the laboratory. What happens in the market or on the roadside is probably very well known, because science and technology, and particularly the scientific establishment, is not so accessible in some kinds of ways. And maybe it is, maybe we're just assuming it is not. I had a great time, like I was mentioning earlier. I had pretty easy access. There were a couple of cases where people denied me access, and there were a couple of places where they also disagreed very violently with what I had to do. But I did get access, and what else is possible if we go in with more difficult questions or more interesting questions? What will we find out? I think that is the new possibility. Innovation, jugaad and all is certainly important, but what happens if we bring it into the laboratory, in the scientific process, in the questions that we ask, and in the way things are done? Yeah.
There's a comment. Aston mass spectrometer was a fantastic machine, but a commercial failure. So if there are no more questions, shall we call it a day? Yeah.
There is, I mean, Professor Dharmadhikari has joined us. I think he was, if he's still there,
Okay.
you can ask him.
Yeah, please.
Some
Please
of
go ahead.
I like this. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello?
Very faintly, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I just read this comment, Aston spectrometer, and then I thought I should say something. Okay, anyway, I think there's a problem with the sound system here.
So maybe you can put off the video, and the sound should be okay.
Okay, anyway, so the point is like Pankaj always says, why people allowed me in the lab and things like that. Most of these issues are discussed in your book, I guess. We've been talking for the last 10 years. But the idea of doing STM, I think I took it up because of the need of the hour. There were no commercial STMs available. IBM had STM, Stanford had STM, but no one, it's not commercially available, very expensive. So you can't just wait and watch, you have to do something. So we started doing it in Pune on that basis. Our approach more was problem-based and student-based. So we have not raised the issue about student training part in your book. Probably at that time we missed out on the student training part of the. And then the STMs, a lot of people made STM, they sold it out, it became a commercial success for some, it was a failure for others. Like IBM STM was never sold, maybe one or two. But there are people in California sold 15,000, 20,000 STMs. So it is not always a commercial point of view. When you start doing a science, you look at a problem, then you have to do it with whatever is available, design, develop, and then you need students. And we find that the students benefit because they are into the new technology. And okay, so that was our idea. I would like you to refer to the recent book by Devon Brewer from California. Are you able to hear me?
We can, but your voice is very hazy, Professor Dharmadhikari.
But anyway, so probably I think I'll write to you. Maybe we can discuss it afterwards. Since you are unable to hear me, there's no point in going ahead. So maybe we can communicate and discuss these issues.
Sure.
Yeah, there are a lot of issues involved in this. Science is one thing. But when you actually develop an instrument based on what you call jugaad, I call it just the way serendipity. I mean, you whatever you land, you put your hands on, you find it useful, you put it. But it requires a lot of innovation in that sense. A lot of R&D is required. Even a junk market will only give you a junk. You have to make it a workable tool, which requires a lot of research and research at the student level, because not many senior people can afford to put so much time. So this idea of doing this jugaad thing of at the frontier level itself is very exciting, and maybe we can discuss it later.
Sure.
I don't understand why my sound is so hazy, because okay, anyway, so we'll sort it out.
Thank you. Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks. Yeah, this will continue our discussion, sir. Okay, somebody has a comment.
Yeah, somebody has a comment. Sajir's comments that I remember for my MSc experiment, I've used a vegetable plate as thermal resistor.
Yeah,
That's a comment. Any more question? So maybe we'll stop for today.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much for this lecture. This has definitely opened up unraveled some of the areas that we had intended to understand through this series, and we hope to have you again soon. Thank you so much.
I would take the last opportunity also to thank Vitasta again, and to Samira. I don't know if she's still there. Great to have you presented here, and I would I will not hesitate to request all the people who joined to consider having a look at the book. And if you do, then I would love to hear back from you in terms of your critical responses as and when you do. So thank you so much for everybody who joined, and also for the organizers.
Thank you so much.